listening to a podcast from The Word.
Greetings, we are back from our annual leave. Yes, even podcasts have annual leave. And Dave, I have a Stack Waddy sent in by a listener, Nick Foreman. And that Stack Waddy runs as follows. Somewhere in Leicester or an American session musician. Okay?
A place in Leicester.
A place in Leicestershire,
okay. Right.
Or an American session musician. There are 8 examples. So here they are. Musician or Leicester locale. Burton Lazars.
Gotta be Leicester. Gotta be Leicester.
Yeah, named in part after a 12th century leprosy hospital.
Very good.
Okay, Packy Axton.
Now, I know this. I know the answer to that. American session musician and related to Hoyt Axton and probably the child of May Axton, who is the axe in Stacks.
Very good. That's a very good answer. Yeah, he was. He played tenor sax on Otis Redding's Pain in My Heart.
There you go.
Earl Shilton.
Sorry, missed that again? Do it again.
Earl Shilton.
Leicester, place in Leicestershire.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with Peter Shilton, who played for Leicester.
Traditional shoe industry supplied boots for the Russian army from Earl Shilton. John O'Gaunt.
Oh, Leicestershire.
Yeah, 6 miles down the road from the home of the pork pie Melton Mowbray factory. Oh, dear. Norbert Putnam.
Oh, that's a session musician.
Yeah,
Nashville. Nashville. Area code was 615.
Very good.
Anyway, go on, carry
Neville
on.
Holt.
Neville Holt. I'm going to say a place in Leicester. I'm going to say a place in Leicestershire.
It is, yeah. At the 2011 census, the population has remained less than 100. Yeah. Hiram Bullock.
Hiram Bullock. It's got to be a session musician.
Yep. Guitar player on Steely Dan's Gaucho.
Oh, right.
And Vernon Birch.
Vernon Birch, that is a musician with the spell Burch.
Yes.
You see, my problem. You see, you can't.
That's fantastic.
Listen, who nominated this?
This is a guy called Nick Foreman.
Thanks very much for that, Nick, and we really appreciate all this. The problem is with musicians, I am cursed with a retentive memory based on an adolescence and young adulthood completely wasted standing in record shops, reading the sleeve
reading
details.
the tiny print that tells you that Vernon Birch was the vocalist. Yeah, exactly.
Everybody. I remember everybody. You know, if you want somebody to, name all the members of Canned Heat, well, we can both do that.
We can probably do that, actually. Larry the Mole Taylor, Henry the Sunflower. Yeah.
Al Blind Eye Wilson. Yeah, there you go. Vito Della Para. Yeah, absolutely.
And the Blind Al. Yeah, that's it. Good.
So anyway, thanks for that.
Very good, Nick. Thank you very much. Keep them coming.
Keep them coming, yeah, definitely. So Michael Parkinson.
I know. One of those moments where, a large percentage of the population just suddenly stopped for a moment, didn't they? And was sort of, you and I had a conversation, we were talking to each other, we just heard the news. And I said, I can imagine now that if I turn on the TV, in 20 minutes' time, I will see Rod Hull and Emu. I will see Billy Connolly telling the bicycle joke. and sure enough, it was all there, wasn't it?
Can I just tell the bicycle joke before we go any further?
Do it, yeah.
Because I actually
went the Scottish accent.
No, I'm not going to attempt to do the Scottish accent at all. I actually went and looked at it again last night. It comes from 1975.
Yeah,
it was one of his early appearances. And the thing about Billy Connolly was he'd been known in Scotland. Really, he was a Scottish phenomenon, not known in the rest of the UK.
Well, also known as as Humble Bum's kind of banjo,
Humble Bums and so forth. But he'd had these records. He'd had these records on Transatlantic, but he wasn't really known nationally. But thanks to Parkinson, he started becoming known nationally. And those were in the days when you could just tell a joke, a simple joke, on Parkinson on Saturday night, and the entire nation, as one, would
be
laugh.
Telling it the next day.
And then would go and desperately try and find somebody the following day who hadn't watched
who hadn't heard it.
I think they could tell the story. And basically,
pass it off as their own.
I was listening to it and watching him tell it. It's a very simple gag. And I couldn't help thinking how unlikely it would be to get on the air in any shape or form.
You couldn't possibly couldn't do it. It's the first thing I thought. Go on, tell it, because it's so good.
So basically, two Glaswegian guys in the pub. How's things going? He says, how's the wife? He says, oh, I killed her. He says, you did what?
He says, you did.
I got fed up. I killed her. He said, yeah, I buried it in the backyard. He said, you didn't. He said, yeah, come on,
I'll show you. I'll show you.
So they go back to the tenement, where they live. They go out the back. There is a freshly dug piece of earth, and the only thing alongside it is a pair of buttocks sticking up from the ground. And he said, what's that all about? He says, I've got to have somewhere to park my bike.
Still, even though you've heard it 100 times, it's still incredibly funny. It's so, you cannot imagine that anyone could tell that joke now.
Here's the point, Mark. When that joke was told in 1975, not a single person in the world who listened in the world of Michael Parkinson and late night television who heard it thought it was in any way offensive. It was a bit risque.
Well, he does say, before he tells it, he says it's a bit of a liability, this, but I'll try it anyway. It's fantastic.
But nobody ever thought, oh, that's a bit misogynist, or anything. It simply wasn't part of people's calculations. They just thought of it as it was like a Beano gag, wasn't it? You could see the picture. It was Viz magazine before Viz magazine was there, wasn't it? Really?
Absolutely, yeah. It's cartoon. It's not real.
It's a cartoon, It is, yeah. So God bless, Billy Connolly and Michael.
Although he did get called. I watched the documentary, which must have been about 5 years ago, where he's interviewed by his son last night, and he does get called up, and rightly, for the famous Helen Mirren interview. Do you remember that?
Vaguely. Go on, remind me.
Well, he interviews Helen Mirren, who is a kind of considered to be the major kind of sex bomb of the time.
Well, she was
of the kind of particularly of the serious acting world. And he said to her something along the lines of, "Don't you feel that your equipment, this is the word he uses, might hold you back from being taken seriously as a serious actor?" And she gets rightly really hot under the collar. And his son, who's interviewing, says, "So how do you feel about that now?" He says, "No, it was a terrible mistake, and I was appallingly sexist, and I'm sort of apologising." But then you have to. They couldn't have made that.
You do have to. But also, let's give the past a bit of slack here, okay? This man interviewed celebrities for how long? 40 years?
Well, he claimed to have interviewed over 2,000 celebrities. So that in itself is just astonishing.
So he did it for 40 years.
Yeah.
During that time, a lot of things will change.
Yeah.
Some of them will be recognised as changing, and other things probably won't be recognised as changing at all, And it's no point kind of bringing him before the bar of history and saying, on the 13th of March, 1976, you said so-so to so-so. This is a guy on a television program. He just, his brain is racing. Nobody's written down the questions for him. Let's remember this. This is not like nowadays where everybody is pre-interviewed to death.
Oh, absolutely.
And when they go on Graham Norton, they say, okay, he's going to tell 5 stories. And what you got to do is line them up.
You got to line them up, and you know what they are. They're rehearsed. Actually, it was interesting that the news coverage tended to have 2 or 3 examples of his big success stories, Muhammad Ali or whatever. And then those 2 examples, the Helen Mirren thing, and also a clip with Meg Ryan, where Meg Ryan refuses to talk to him. Which I thought it was a bit unfair on him, really, because she was the one who's being difficult,
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to have this kind of balanced approach. You say, this guy was great, but he was also terrible. Just in case you thought he was terrible, don't worry, we've covered that off. So
I tell you, the other thing that struck me about him, think about him, because he's an extraordinary, uniquely powerful figure in British television for a long, long period of time. Nearest thing to a Johnny Carson, Yeah. And in Britain, you didn't have loads of chat show hosts. Well, you did later, but not at that time. So he's very much the person who kind of defined the turf, and that he would get on anybody from a extraordinary venerable figure from the movies like Billy Wilder or David Niven.
Yeah, Orson Welles, fantastic.
Absolutely. You think of these figures; they're almost figures from history.
Yeah,
and then he'd get comics, and he'd get Rod Hull and Emu, and he'd get politicians plugging books and Jane Fonda and God knows what. And so, he had to define what it was that made a successful chat show. And the thing that struck me watching them he manufactured something in television that became a hugely important component of television that arguably didn't exist on television until he came, and that was charm. And so that was how you were a successful guest on a chat show. You were charming.
Yes.
If you were David Niven, you were effortlessly charming because you were. And if you were a difficult guy, like, I don't know, Brian Clough, you showed your charming side in front of Michael Parkinson, because that's what he wanted you to do. He didn't want you to win a serious argument or anything like that. You didn't have to be absolutely hilarious. You just had to leave people thinking while they made a cup of tea afterwards. He seems nice.
I tell you what struck me, that I couldn't agree with that more, but I tell you what struck me watching it last night was that before that, when did it start, Parkinson's?
71. 71.
Well, before 71, I don't remember having the opportunity to ever get to know what film stars or whatever, or what they were really like. You see those interviews with James Stewart, you see Orson Welles,
that was amazing.
It's absolutely astonishing. You had, up till that point, you'd never had any access to those people at all.
Well, David Frost,
from their films.
David Frost had done a bit of that.
Not so much, though. Yeah,
never quite as much.
Tended to do one person quite at length rather than just get people on. You just got a taste of what.
And also, like. Parkinson was a film buff, wasn't he? So it was, don't forget. I mean, that was how I first remember him. Because I come from the north of England, where you'd be surprised to learn, and the kind of magazine shows that were on British television in the north in the 60s were produced out of Manchester largely. They're out of Granada and so forth. So all those people like Mike Scott and Bill Grundy and Michael Parkinson were kind of known to us before they were known to a national audience.
Oh, yeah, he was on local television, wasn't he? Yeah.
And Michael Parkinson was... he always wanted to nail his colours to the mast of movies. He
did a film. He did a film show. Yeah.
Well, he did cinema, didn't he? Or did he?
Cinema.
Cinema is called. And so I really remember clearly. So much of what I know about Hollywood movie stars is underpinned by what I learned from seeing them on Parkinson, seeing Billy Wilder.
Completely.
And seeing Peter Ustinov and John Wayne and
Peter
Fred
Ustinov was
Astaire.
fantastic on it. Yeah,
Peter Ustinov, never forgotten him talking about a film director. I can't even remember who the film director was. But he says, "I like the idea of a man who aims low and misses."
And misses, yeah.
And that made me laugh ever since, And of course, the other thing.
There's a lovely bit of the clip last night. Peter Ustinov's just improvising opera. Singing absolute nonsense with Dudley Moore. It's phenomenal. Going back to his Yorkshireness, it reminded me so much of the things you told me about your dad. There's a brilliant bit in the programme where he talks about interviewing Muhammad Ali for the, third or fourth time, when it goes really badly wrong. Do you remember that? And they really, initially they got on fabulously, but then Ali has the kind of, religious conversion, becomes a slightly different bloke. And he's very aggressive. And it's a disastrous interview. And he goes back to his room, and his dad, who loved Ali, had come all the way down from Yorkshire to London to watch him record this. And he comes to the dressing room and you think, what's he going to say? And his dad says to him, how do you think that went, son? He says, I think it went really terribly. He said, I do too. He said, well, what should I have done, Dad? He said, you should have thumped him. And I thought that was really interesting because the modern parent feels that if something goes wrong for their child, the first thing they do, their offspring, they go straight in and they go, don't worry, you were brilliant. It was all fine. It was his fault. You were fantastic. You'll bounce back, get back in the saddle. Do you know what I mean? I thought it was just so kind of prosaic and straight down the line.
It's really funny. The last time I saw Mark and Parkinson, it must have been some TV thing that he did not that long ago at Barnsley Cricket Club. And I saw this on YouTube. And of course, Michael Parkinson was a very good teenage cricketer, very good, in a part of the country where you had to be really good to get in the Barnsley Cricket Club team. So he kept the young Jeff Boycott out of the batting lineup at Barnsley Cricket Club, which is amazing to think. And his other big mate was Dickie Bird, who, of course, became the great famous umpire. And there were the three of them gathered at Barnsley Cricket Club for some kind of event, some TV thing. And I thought, this is just absolutely astonishing. These three genuine legends.
Proper legends.
All in their 80s, back at that cricket club where they all started. And absolutely, quite an innings, as you might say.
Yeah.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
So, Mark, as you know, I've been in France. An opportunity to visit France is always an opportunity to catch up with what's happening in the world of smoking, because it is the world headquarters of smoking.
It is.
And I actually found myself having coffee in an outdoor cafe. And after a while, saying to Alison, I'm going to have to move from here because I feel ill with passive smoking. And we're in the open air, It didn't really ought to happen. Anyway, everybody's gone for the vaping. And therefore, they've got these huge pieces of metal equipment that they get out of their pockets or their bags or whatever. And this equipment is so huge, I keep looking around for the person further down the road who's holding up a theodolite or some large post, because it looks as if they're about to survey the area, And so you think about a cigarette. A cigarette used to be a thin kind of phallic thing, didn't it? You know what I mean? That you kind of threw away when you were done with it. People got huge amounts of knowledge about how they manipulated it near their mouth and made it look sexy and so forth. Well, you can't do that with vaping equipment, because effectively, and I'm addressing this particularly to the female vapors, what they've ended up doing, Mark, and I realized this in France while looking around at the number of fabulously elegant, very well turned out French women struggling with these huge, great metal devices. I felt like saying, Madam, you are smoking a pipe, for goodness sake. If somebody had said to you 10 years ago, do you imagine you would abandon your cigarettes and start smoking a pipe? They would say, but no. But that's what they're effectively doing, isn't it?
It is.
That's just my...
It's the same amount of equipment, isn't it? Same amount of preparation, same amount of ritual.
Absolutely. And it's about as attractive. It's actually slightly less attractive than a pipe. Anyway. So that's vaping. What were we going to talk about next?
Well, we're going to. People have been sending in. Do you remember we started doing the stuff about those lost TV documentaries about
absolutely
forgotten rock bands of the 70s? Someone sent in the one about Global Village Trucking Company, which is amazing. I've finished up watching pretty much all of it, actually. And it's really interesting. It was made in 1973. I think the BBC made a documentary about them. And this was remade again in about 2007 or 8 after they had a reunion in Leytonstone. And it uses the old footage. It also has new footage, and it tracks down members of the group. So it's really, really interesting. But basically, those voiceovers, that tone of the Chumley Warner voiceover that we're always talking about. This one's classic. Goes something like, when 5 young men decide to form a pop group, they don't usually set up in a house in a remote cottage in the wilds of Norfolk and move in all their girlfriends. But then Global Village Trucking Company aren't an ordinary pop group. They're not worried about making money, and they won't take the usual shortcuts to success. They want to do it without the moguls of the record business and the professional manipulators. Global Village want to do it their way. And their way, as you remember, I remember Global Village Trucking Company because I remember seeing them in Oxford in 1975. And they were a kind of answer to the Grateful Dead. The whole point of them was that they lived communally. And that's what this film is about. It's fantastic. It's talking about this. There they all are with all their girlfriends and their roadies and their managers and these babies, and they're living in this derelict old cottage in the countryside. And the women, of course, classic division labour. The women do all the housework and all the cooking. The men kind of try and stop the place falling apart. At one point, it opens with a guy looking out a hole in the roof, and he said, I can see the sky through the roof. If I mend it, we won't be able to see the sky anymore. And they're like, get on with it. It's like Neil from The Young Ones, get on with it, for Christ's sake, And it just struck me that, the whole thing is that their manager's there, and he lives with them too, and he's 18. He went on actually to be the CEO of Chrysalis Records, a guy called Jeremy Lascelles. And it just struck me that where the Grateful Dead are different from them is the Grateful Dead used to rehearse all day. Grateful Dead really, really, really took it seriously. They spent 10 hours a day working out the music and becoming absolutely phenomenal at it, rather than sitting around making great vats of vegetable curry and lying in hammocks and, do you know what I mean? And wearing woolly hats and talking about the propaganda, the strategies of their lifetime, and whether or not they should have creature comforts. They're talking about saying, you get used to these creature comforts. We're just trying to live without them, like central heating. And you think, what kind of person can do that, can afford to do that? The answer is really well-off people. You suddenly realise that actually the Global Village Trucking Company are all very well off. And I can remember in 1975 going to see them and being told that the keyboard player, James Lascelles, or Lascelles, I don't know how you pronounce it, was the second cousin of the Queen. His second cousin, his father was Lord Harewood, I think it was.
Absolutely.
And he was therefore, it was the seventh Earl of Harewood, that's right, who was the Queen's cousin. So he was actually, Prince Charles was his second cousin. This guy's virtually in line to the throne. So this is a very, very posh group. And they can really afford not to do it. And the other thing that struck me as really interesting, which is a theme that goes through all these films we've been watching, is that the general feeling about the music industry then was the music industry was just full of villains, manipulators, crooks. Do you know what I mean? Skullduggery, thievery, people who are there to rip you off, which I'm sure to the logic extent it probably was, But that's the whole thing. It's all about trying to avoid getting ripped off, so we're going to do it our own way. And then you meet all the people later on. And as I say, Jeremy Lascelles went on to be the CEO of Chrysalis Records, but none of the members of the group really do anything terribly distinguished, But it's interesting.
It's interesting listening to all these TV commentaries. All have the same kind of looking down their noses at the tawdry music business, and you feel like saying, "What the bloody hell are you going about? You work in television, for goodness' sake!" If ever there was an industry, dominated by reptiles, it's television, for goodness sake.
Yeah, where do you treating you very abruptly? Yeah, exactly.
Where do you get off
exploitative? I know.
This high ground on the music business,
I must mention a couple of other ones that were standing actually very briefly. One was about a group called Affinity. Do you remember them? Affinity.
Oh, God, they were kind of jazz.
They were. Yeah. Well done. Right. Yeah, Linda Hoyle was the singer.
Linda Hoyle was Affinity. They were on Vertigo, weren't they?
I don't know, possibly. I don't know, actually. But there's a little clip of them going on the road with Annie Nightingale, who's really good, actually. Annie Nightingale asks really serious questions. And it's all about how tough it is. There they are. Yeah. And the girl, Linda, says, look, I don't know how long I could do this. We make £15 a week. The roadies get 25, get £15. And it's absolute hell. We have to drive 600 miles a day to play to 9 people, It's really hard. And the other one, which was sent in, who sent in the Affinity one? It was sent in by, can't find it now, Paul Harrison, that's right. And I'll also say that, the Gene Vincent one, which is sent in by Pete Compton.
Oh,
and Gene, that is amazing. And basically,
that's not his MU1.
1969.
Oh, is it? I thought it was later. Go on. All right.
Yeah, 1969. And he's, oh, God, it's wretched. And he is touring Britain and playing in places like the Isle of Wight. You see him crossing on the ferry. And it could not be more dilapidated, the whole thing. Yeah. He's surrounded by promoters who won't pay him, and they say, we'll have the money on Monday, or it's locked up in the room upstairs, we can't open that now, but we'll make sure you get it, And I think he might have been in some way involved with Don Arden, and the Inland Revenue and his ex-wife and all these people are all combining to kind of make this tour stop or be utterly disastrous. And there are just sad moments of him sort of being interviewed by cheery journalists. Like, what are you about his favourite things? And he's sitting there in some destitute little B&B. Do you know what I mean? And it's heartbreaking. And then 2 years later, he was no longer, was he? I mean, I think he died in 71. So poor old chap.
He died in 1971, and you know, one of the last people he met, who was on his way up, just as Gene Vincent was on his way down, was David Bowie. Because when David Bowie did his famous trip to the United States, in February, he stayed in a house in Los Angeles, owned by a guy who was involved with Gene Vincent, and there was a little studio there. And I think the two of them met. I think Gene Vincent was actually supposed to record some very early David Bowie song or something like that. But it's very strange how those things turn out. I'll tell you the funny thing about David Bowie this week, actually. I was watching Howard Stern, a clip of Howard Stern, who I like. Talking to Ian Hunter.
Oh, I saw that too. Somebody tweeted it, didn't they?
Actually, it was Danny Baker. I've just realized.
Danny Baker tweeted it. Was really good, yeah.
And he's got Ian Hunter as a guest on his show, and Ian Hunter is about to play All the Young Dudes acoustically in the studio. And Howard Stern says, "Tell us about how you got this song." And of course, David Bowie wrote the song. And Ian Hunter says, "Well, we were about to break up, really, but David Bowie, the bloke David Bowie, wanted us to do a couple of his songs. I think at first he offered Suffragette City or something.
Yeah, he did. They didn't like it.
And they didn't like it, and so he ended up doing All the Young Dudes." And Howard Stern says, "How did you feel about this? How did you feel about such an," forgive me, he probably uses the adjective iconic.
He may well do, yeah.
"How did you feel about such a massive, iconic figure as David Bowie giving you one of his greatest songs?" And Ian Hunter says, "Well, I don't know, he was just a little bloke from Beckenham."
Yeah.
And I thought, that is a brilliant line, because the truth about pop music is they're all little blokes from Beckenham. Yeah. They all start off as little blokes from Beckenham.
Until
trying to get some kind of deal, trying to make it work. And we've lost sight of that recently. And so Howard Stern, who I do like, I think Howard Stern's a brilliant broadcaster and so forth. But he'll have to just pass as a kind of placeholder for all media, outlets nowadays. They all act as if, when they're talking about popular music, as if they're reading from a massive, great book of rock that stands on a lectern and is inscribed in gold, where it's very clear how the Bee Gees are, or how David Bowie is, or Bob Marley, or whatever.
But that's just the critical view.
We all agreed years ago, didn't we, that they are just absolute cultural giants. Yeah. No, we didn't. No, you weren't paying attention. No. It didn't work like that, and it doesn't work like that. And I thought Ian Hunter really served to remind us there that all of these people were once little blokes from Beckenham.
Because why should you accept this song? Because the assumption is you turned down a David Bowie song. Yeah, but he wasn't really David Bowie. He was not then,
And also, in the case of All the Young Dudes, who's the person who created All the Young Dudes? Ian Hunter. Ian Hunter's extraordinary delivery of that thing.
What it reminded me of, because I think, Danny, there was a thread after that where people had posted various songs that Bowie had written. It just reminded me that all those guys in those days were hustlers. They just thought it's not going to last long. The Beatles constantly writing songs for other people. Bob Dylan constantly trying to get other people to cover his songs. And Bowie was there. Bowie not only got Peter Noon, to cover one of his songs, but I think played piano on the top of the
He played piano
on the song, I think. That's how much he wanted that song to be a success. He wasn't being priggish and standoffish about the critical, status of Peter afternoon. He just was a professional songwriter. He probably thought, this is all going to be over in 2 years' time. I've got to keep going.
Absolutely. And this leads me to, I've been reading DJ Taylor's excellent new biography of George Orwell.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, George Orwell is, he was the only figure who's got a statue dedicated to him outside Broadcasting House, hasn't he?
Yes.
He worked for the BBC for years, but they don't have a recording of him, which makes me laugh all the time anyway. And DJ Taylor's book about George Orwell is fantastic. It's really good. So George Orwell is of course, Eric Blair. Eric Blair goes to Eton, then goes off to Burma to be a policeman in the Burmese police, does that for about 18 months, then comes back, decides he wants to be a writer, goes and lives with his parents in Southwold, of course, which is where you were only the other week. Yeah. And he mooches about Southwold, saying he wants to be a writer, if anybody's interested. And DJ Taylor has talked to a load of people who remember as small children him being in town, or their parents used to clean for the Blairs or whatever. Yeah. He remembers the town. They give him an idea of what the town's view of George Orwell was. And they all thought he was a bit of a weirdo who wouldn't join in anything. And why was he coming back here living off his parents on their reduced circumstance? Why didn't he get a proper job, Yeah. And so I just thought it was really interesting to be reminded of the fact that even such a massive cultural figure as George Orwell, who is, if anything, a bigger giant than David Bowie, you know what I mean, was just another bloke sitting around in Southwold, go out and get a damn job.
Go out and get usefully employed,
Or cheer up for crying out loud and join in the party or whatever, And he was just, he was just trying to project his kind of otherness. And I find it really interesting. Anyway, it's a terribly good book. DJ Taylor's.
That's good.
New biography of George Orwell. Yeah. Highly recommended.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
Well, it's always nice to know that a friend of the pod is shaking things up, stirring things up out there in Media Land at this sleepy time of the year. And the particular culprit this week is Paul Burke, who's been writing in that well-known pop magazine, The Spectator, about how punk rock was overrated in its impact. Give us the headlines of this, Paul.
Well, the first thing that started, I was going to plug on. A couple of weeks before, I did a piece about skinheads being unfairly maligned over the years, which sometimes they deserve, and how they really brought reggae and Trojan records into our lives long before Bob Marley was popular. And it went down really well. They said, got anything else? And I thought, I know what I've always thought. Punk was a bit overrated, wasn't it? And there's a reason for that. I mean, I liked it when it first started. The only punk band I really regard as a punk band are the Sex Pistols. And once the Clash came along, I thought, oh, my God.
But your kind of premise is that, A, punk was a kind of passing fad and nowhere near as big a deal as people thought it was. And B, that actually its kind of slightly overcooked legacy is due to a middle-class media. Is that right?
I would, yeah, I'd stand by that. I think what happened was people will often say that thing, oh, yeah, we just threw away our Yes LPs and we cut our hair and we dumped prog for punk. And you think, yeah, most of us weren't into either of those things. We liked ABBA. I mean, very popular things like David Bowie, Bob Marley, Hot Chocolate. Most of the population, I would contend, weren't that bothered. I think the Pistols made an impact because there was a frenzied media attention towards them, and Middle England was, oh my God, these terrible people, and they were nothing of the sort. I mean, I described in that piece as the Bay City Rollers with attitude. They had a very shrewd manager, and they were very, very well marketed. But when I was writing that, I listened back to some of the punk, and the Pistols really do sound really good even now. But no, what happened was
the majority of that stuff didn't get much radio play, did it? No. That's part of the reason. Yeah.
No, a lot of it. And a lot of it wasn't very good. It's, that thing that anyone can form a band, but the trouble is a lot of people did. Yeah. And they'd go on about that DIY ethos. Well, I mean, I wasn't around, but wasn't that what skiffle was? Or even the Beatles? Or they just formed a band, didn't they? There was nothing unusual about doing that.
I think the thing that was really unusual about punk is they led with the propaganda rather than the music.
Yeah.
So it was highly developed propaganda. And so I've always thought of it as a religious movement rather than a musical one. Basically, it was moral rearmament, if you like. Punk rock was. Now let's take pop music and divide it into good people and bad people. And we are the good people. Yes, that's how it works.
Because I stuck that on Facebook and a load of people loved it. And I wouldn't say people go, oh, yeah, God, they're great. That is. But the people who didn't like it were really quite, it's like you'd offended their religion, as you say.
This is it.
Rightly said, or their politics. And I got quite an impassioned private email from a friend of mine, not a great friend, but, somebody I've known for years. He said, look, I can't believe it. I always thought you were a good guy. And it was everything you said.
Oh, no, it's a political issue. But don't you think a lot of it's to do with the fact that most punk bands were far more interesting to read about than they were to listen to?
No, quite.
In fact, you didn't understand their records. It's not like listening to the Eagles or Queen or something. You think, well, that's quite a nice record. I don't know anything about the group. Unless you read about, that's why the pop press did so well out of it. Unless you read about these groups in the pop press, they didn't really make any sense.
Well, that's what Chuck Berry famously said about the Clash. They played in the Clash, and he said, what are they saying? But they're clearly angry about something. But rule number one, if you're angry about something, make sure people know what it is.
Enunciate with clarity, which, of course, Chuck Berry always did that.
You absolutely what he was saying. No, and I think those people who jettisoned Yes and Genesis, I mean, it's a massive generalization, but they did seem to become, cultural commentators, doing BBC documentaries. And I'm forgetting, because I'm getting so old now, despite my loud shirt, just how long ago it was. I mean, it's 46 years ago. So the people making those documentaries, even if they're 46, won't remember a single bit of it. So they're relying on the footage. And there was a lot of footage from the 70s. About these.
Well, also misuse footage. The famous case is the film of the bin bags piling up in Leicester Square, which is used in absolutely every last documentary about punk rock. It actually that film from 2 years later.
Yes, of course it was, because
nothing to do with
I
the
just
story.
don't think it was that big a deal. And as you say, it led with politics, and and it still is. And I would argue, when we talk about, people talk about it a lot, particularly in London, about gentrification. Gentrification started with the Clash. It's when. This sounds like I don't like middle class, but I mean, I've spent my life trying to be middle class. I live in Muswell Hill, for heaven's sake.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. So got nothing against, but that's the first time I think that someone middle class thought, oh, I'll have some of that, because he was in the 101ers and was a pub rock band, and he modelled himself on Woody Guthrie, and he was a public school boy. I thought, I'll have some of that. So he did that, and I think everything else followed. Whether it was a season ticket to Arsenal or a little 2-bedroom house in Fulham.
You see, I think all popular music, doesn't matter what it is, over a period of time. Actually, if you scratch anybody, from Bob Dylan to the Bay City Rollers to the Sex Pistols to whoever came along last week, underneath it all, they're a bunch of chancers just trying to get famous. That's all they're bothered about. And they'll do whatever it is.
And using gimmickry, most of them, actually. The Beatles being the best examples. The millions of gimmicks the Beatles had to get attention.
I think the best one ever, and I admire him, but oh my God, obsessed with being famous was David Bowie.
Oh my God!
I think if the Laughing Gnome had been a hit, he'd been happy for the rest of his life as an ITV game show host. But it wasn't. And so he kept borrowing, didn't he? He kept, that's not working, I'll have a go. And then when the Mark Bolan glam thing ran out, who's next? Lou Reed, Mick and Keith. He just went on and on and on. But he did it very, very well. And his record...
That sounds like a future column, Paul. I think you should...
Bowie, especially since he died, he's practically God. I really will be chased down the streets if I do that.
Nobody will be talking to you at the barbecues of Muswell Hill in the future if you go on slaughtering these sacred cows. But keep doing it for us, Paul.
No, it's irresistible.
It's valuable entertainment, and we very much appreciate it. The only thing Mark really pointed out was the headline it should have had. It was an open goal.
Oh, can I say, let me stop. Was it Never Mind the Bollocks?
No.
That's my original headline was Never Mind the Bollocks, the truth about punk is what
it was the great smash hits mantra, and taken up elsewhere too, was like punk never happened.
There you go.
Yeah.
But David, I'm sure you wrote a column along those lines, or your blog or something. I couldn't find it.
I probably did. I probably did.
Never happened. Yeah, for most people, it sort of didn't.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, well, that applies to, certainly the biggest thing of that period of time. As you point out in your column, the really great records of 1976 that changed the world genuinely was Donna Summer's I Feel Love.
Yeah.
It sounds as fresh as a day. It was fantastic.
And disco, exactly.
I thought there was something wrong with me when I first heard that, because I thought, do you know, it's a weird thing. I thought, I'm not supposed to like this. I'm a geezer. I like punk, and I just loved it. It just, and I still do. And I decided I would be a disco diva from that moment.
But it's interesting how little you hear, the Clash or the Pistols or the Damned or the Banshees or whoever, on radio now. It's kind of disappeared. It just didn't quite stand up.
Not really radio friendly.
No,
it's not radio friendly, certainly. No, whereas I Feel Love could have been made last week. Because millions of records have been made in the footsteps of I Feel Love.
Wonderful. Right in the middle of
look, thanks very much for joining us.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
Well, every Friday night, as various people know, we do a quiz. Very well attended, live, all over the world, international following. Very good fun. And we've started doing, the answer used to just be an act, a musician or a band or whatever. And we've started to develop that in the direction of albums. And we did one this week about Bridge Over Troubled Water. And it just struck us both listening to it. What an absolutely astonishing record that is. And I can remember so vividly when it came out. Do you remember one of those records where it was everywhere? It was in shops. It was everybody's home you went to was playing it. It was on the radio. It was just absolutely everywhere.
I can actually literally remember hearing it for the first time. I could take you to where I stood when I heard it for the first time. It's not that far from where I live now. It's in a record shop in North London. On a Saturday morning, I was a student, and I just heard this playing. I think I heard Bye Bye Love. I thought, what's that? And I went and looked at the counter. My goodness, there's a new Simon & Garfunkel record. And I took my student grant, which I think was £40 a term, and spent whatever
blew about a quarter of it. Right.
Well, it was pre-decimal, so it would be 32 and 6 probably, or something like that. Spent that money on it because I'd previously bought Bookends, which came out at 67, I think, and then I hadn't bought the one in between, which is, of course, the soundtrack for The Graduate. The Graduate was what had made them go absolutely massive. But Bridge Over Troubled Water was the biggest selling album in the world for about 4 years.
It was for until 1972 or something. It was, absolutely.
Absolutely astonishing. And the thing that struck me about it, I listened to it again when we were compiling that quiz, and just for fun. It's such kind of unlikely multi-platinum album in that it's not kind of calculated at all. I mean, it starts with a really slow gospel ballad. You know what I mean? Yeah. Which takes ages to get to the point, doesn't it? Bridge Over Troubled Water. Long piano intro, all that kind of thing, you know. And then it has a piece of world music, doesn't it? El Conde Paso. Which was the kind of South American.
The variety of it is incredible, isn't it? Because that's the other thing, is that most records tended to be ploughing a particular groove, didn't they?
Not that one.
It had the box, it had Cecilia, and there were El Conde Paso. They were so different. And I can remember hearing El Conde Paso and having never heard music like that in my life. You know, this was 70, I'd never heard music from the Andes. You take all these things for granted now. Seemed absolutely.
It has 2 songs on it that were about his relationship with Art Garfunkel, which was never easy, was it? Because you had this duo where really Paul could do most of the work, but people still wanted the duo and they wanted the choir boy soloing of Art Garfunkel.
Yeah.
But there was always that great tension, wasn't there? Paul probably thinking, I can do without him, and Art Garfunkel thinking, you can do without me. I'm going to go off and be in Catch 22.
In Catch 22, he went off and started recording. In fact, Paul had to move he was living in Blue Jay Way, wasn't he? Paul had to go and live and rent a place nearby in order to be able to carry on working on the record and see him. What's the opening line to Tom, get your plane right on time?
So Tom is Art Garfunkel, who was the Tom at Tom and Jerry, which was the group, the duo that they were when they were kind of high school kids. Tom, get your plane right on time. I know your part will go fine.
Go fine. Fly down to Mexico.
Down to Mexico, which is where it was going. And Mike Nichols was directing it, wasn't he? Mike Nichols had directed The Graduate. But the other one that is also So Long Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
Is actually about Art Garfunkel. And Art Garfunkel used to sing it, not knowing it was about him.
Yeah.
Didn't know until about 3 years later when Paul Simon mentioned it in an interview. All of the nights we'd harmonize till dawn, architects may come and architects may go and never change your point of view. When I run dry, I stop a while and think of you. It's a classic male thing, But they couldn't say how much they
couldn't tell him.
Each other. Couldn't tell him.
I know.
So
got to write these love messages in songs. You can't possibly say to somebody to their face. I know.
But it's the idea that Art Garfunkel didn't know until a few years later that it was about him. But it's extraordinary. And things like Cecilia, where you were talking about this, weren't you, the other day, that recorded at a party or something?
Well, it was recorded at a party. They were at a party and they just ran a little reel-to-reel tape and got a rhythm going. And I think Paul Simon's brother was involved in this, and they were just playing guitars and bongos and things. And then they took it back to the producer and they made a loop, amazing at the time, made a loop of this thing, a minute long, and then took it to the studio and just built up until he got an idea for a guitar part, an idea for a melody, but completely different one. There's bits where they drop bits of percussion on the floor and they record all the sounds. So, the sound of that record was so incredible, wasn't it? The sound of the Boxer, my God.
The drumming particularly, interestingly, the Boxer, and there's another track I was listening to. I was thinking the drumming is remarkable there. It's Hal Blaine who plays the drums.
Yeah.
And so it's the same drummer who played on the Ronettes' "Be My Baby," and a million and one other records. But that kind of crashing, distant snare sound on the Boxer comes from the fact that they took him outside and put him in the stairwell of the CBS studios in wherever they were, 52nd Street, New York. And, because they wanted this big echoey sound, It's like John Bonham did later with Led Zeppelin, Headley Grange and so forth. They put him at the bottom of a stairwell to get that extraordinary sound. But it is amazing. And of course, it still goes on giving. The Baby Driver becomes, inspires a movie, does it?
That was what's playing in the credits of the Edgar Wright film. That's the name of the film, I still can't get over how fantastic it is. I was well over 16 when it came out. I remember hearing the opening lyric to The Boxer. I'm just a poor boy, though my story is seldom told. I've squandered my resistance for a pocket full of mumbles, such promises. All lies and jest till a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. That's a fantastic lyric.
The scanning, scansion of that, it singles itself. Absolutely.
It does.
Say it again. Say it again.
It says, I am just a poor boy, though my story is seldom told. I have squandered my resistance. That's incredible, isn't it? Squandered my resistance for a pocket full of mumbles. Such are promises. Just
all lies and jest. All lies and jest is Shakespearian. That is.
Yeah, it is.
It feels Shakespearean.
Yeah, as does Pocket Full of Mumbles, actually. Such are promises.
Till a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. There's not a wasted syllable in that whole thing.
Yeah,
it's absolutely astonishing. I was watching an interview with him where he was talking about, just his early career recently, and talk about when he was in England. So 65. That's 65. He's in England. He's living in Brentwood, Essex, with his girlfriend, and he's working the folk clubs, and he's doing very well. He's making £25 a night, which was proper money in 1965. And then he gets a call from Garfunkel, or I think he get a letter saying they put out "Sound of Silence" again with the backing,
with the rhythm section. Yeah,
and this time it looks as if it might actually get the charts.
Yeah.
So he hops on a plane and goes back.
Which is, people say, kind of invented folk rock, don't they? Yeah. That sound. Wasn't that the sound that...
But the interesting thing about Paul Simon, two things, actually, is even at that age, he'd had a real professional experience in the music business because he'd worked for publishers. He'd been the guy who'd gone out and played songs that the publisher wished, not necessarily songs he wrote, but songs that the publisher wished to get covered by record companies. He would go in there and just play them. Consequently, he learned very early on about how you sell a song. He could do it with somebody else's songs, and he could do it with his own as well. So he kind of understood pop shape really well. The other thing that struck me about the two of them is I think they were the first people to come to pop music having had real choices, because they'd both gone to university, hadn't they?
Yeah.
And Paul Simon had just said, I'm going to take some time off. He was doing law, wasn't he, at Columbia, I think. And I don't know what Art Garfunkel was doing, but I think he was away as well. And so, they had a kind of quite nice middle-class life mapped out for them. And then this was the kind of flaky alternative that they might be.
Would have had parents breathing down their necks saying, what are you doing? Go back to what you're guaranteed to be able to make a career out of.
Absolutely. And that was why So Long Frank Lloyd Wright is so called, because Garfunkel was talking about going and being an architect. And actually later on, not long afterwards, still when the checks from Bridge Over Troubled Water are still jamming the mailbox on a regular basis, Art Garfunkel goes off to teach mathematics in the school, doesn't he?
Did.
It's just absolutely incredible.
His entire career's been full of things like that, isn't it? Going off and just walking across America.
Walks across.
Well, he could afford to.
He's probably walk across China as well.
I know.
In fact, look, there he goes.
Yeah, you can certainly see the top of his head. We should mention.
No, that's a good ending for that.
We'll end there.
There we go.
Great. You can. I was going to say we could mention Robbie Robertson, but we don't have to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was taking advantage of the opportunity for an ending of a bit.
No, that's good.
Talk about Robbie Robertson all you want.
But just do a little bit on Robbie Robertson. Why not? I hadn't thought about it.
No, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
We're all in.
Okay. One final thought, because this happened actually during our holiday period. Actually, so sadly we couldn't broadcast about it early. But the passing of Robbie Robertson. One thing that struck me was, there's someone whose songwriting skills were so based on this idea of being fascinated by the characters and by storytelling. And I was just reminded of how extraordinary his life was. His mum was part of the Cayuga and Mohawk tribe, wasn't she?
Easy for you to say.
It's easy for me to say. And spent quite a lot of his time on their reservation near Toronto, didn't he? His dad, he didn't discover who his dad was till I think he was about 14. He thought it was the person who brought him up discovered his dad was a professional gambler who was killed in a hit and run accident. By the age of 14, he was sort of almost a professional musician. You know, he was working he joined a carnival, hadn't he? A traveling carnival. He'd been an assistant on a freak show. He was playing all the local teen dances when he was 14. You kind of talk about people like George Harrison being really young. He was 17 when he was in Hamburg. But I mean, Robbie Robertson was touring with the Hawks when he was 15. They had records out co-written by him. It's absolutely astonishing. And the thing that struck me was that Dylan, who's actually 2 years older than him, must have been really slightly in awe of him, because Dylan was from quite a comfortable middle-class background, wasn't he? His dad ran a furniture and appliances shop in Hibbing, and he was highly educated, and and Dylan had invented this story, a press story about being the kind of guy who worked on carnivals and circuses, and he worked on a carnival, didn't he? And he rode boxcars, and he kind of hitchhiked that. And then he meets Robbie Robertson, who's 2 years younger than him, who'd actually done all these things, who'd genuinely done them and lived this absolutely extraordinary life. And I think he must have been slightly in awe of him, really. And
well, I suppose the same thing can be said about when we talk about Bob Newworth, who was Dylan's big mate, wasn't he? And kind of assistant. Well, Bob Newworth had done the things that Bob Dylan just sang about, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so there must have been many occasions when Bob Dylan wrote songs based on the experience of Bob Newworth, because Bob Newworth's experience would be a lot richer on account of him not being Bob Dylan. You know, you can go off and do things, can't you, if you're not Bob Dylan? Whereas as soon as you're as well known as Bob Dylan, your experience becomes quite
restricted,
doesn't it?
It does, incredibly.
Restricted. So my thought about Robbie Robertson is the band, the story of the recording career of the band, which is obviously what Robbie Robertson's reputation is all about, all comes down to, is it the greatest example of the truth that in popular music a miss is as good as a mile that you'll find anywhere in popular music? Because the first band album is marvelous. The second band album is better than that. The third band album is not quite as good as that. The fourth is terrible. And so it goes on. And it wasn't for want of trying. You know what I mean? Something happened with that second band album, because it's a really odd thing, isn't it? That Robbie Robertson was the kind of leader, but he didn't sing really. The singers were three other guys. So he was kind of throwing his voice through these three other people, wasn't he? And he wrote about America, and he wasn't American.
Yeah,
which is it's like finding out that Richard Thompson, who wrote Legion Leaf, came from Germany or something. It's an extraordinary idea. And then later on, when you come to Cahoots and the fourth album, he's just desperately trying to still do the same thing, the River Hymn and things like that, and it just doesn't work. He just kind of lies there, And there's just
it's true. Magic. It was a steady decline, really, wasn't it? Because you think
really
I'd forgotten that they were pretty big when the first record came out because the weight was used in Easy Rider.
The weight, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
And that was just enormous, wasn't it? And so they were on that kind of plateau, and it just kind of slightly tailed off. But
it is. They are also a unique case of, my experience of, hip taste, which we often deride, unless we agree with it. At the time of the band's first and second album, suddenly hip taste was just completely overtaken by the band, wasn't it? Everybody just wanted to talk about the band. George Harrison went off to America
to try Clapton said, I'm going to split the group. That's right.
I want to be the band.
Legion Leaf,
And normally when people are like that, when people affect things in that way, it's because they're really kind of outlandish or they go further. Whereas the thing about the band was they didn't go further. They went less far, actually. Yes. You know, the characteristic of the band was their extraordinary restraint. It was almost spooky, their restraint. You know, there's
which
nothing
you could
flashy
apply to
about
the way
us.
they looked too.
In everything. There's no mad guitar solos. There's nothing obvious here at all.
No, that weird thing that you were not sure who the leader of the group was, which was the idea. They wanted it to be, in fact, he was only the leader, Robbie, because nobody else wanted to take the job, and also because he finished up writing most of the songs. But, I mean, it was a democracy, wasn't it? And all that was different. And also, I still think it's extraordinary that, at the time of, Pink Floyd and... Jimi Hendrix and, Traffic and, all that with, Disraeli Gears, their Satanic Majesties. They were going back into this kind of Huckleberry Finn, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Deep American South, jazz, ragtime, American roots. They are writing songs about the American Civil War. It's fantastic, really, you think about it. There was nothing remotely like that. And I can't help but feel that they're the kind of DNA in the way that people like Iggy Pop are to punk rock music. They are the kind of DNA to the whole concept of Americana, that idea of all American roots music. Don't you think? There's a certain sound. Groups like REM, I think there's certain...
I'm not sure about REM, but I think REM is slightly different. But certainly I agree that there are 1,000,001 bands who, when they play, they close their eyes and try to persuade themselves that they sound a bit like the band. And they don't. They just don't. Nobody had that fingerprint. Doesn't Nick Lowe tell that story about when the band came over to play the Isle of Wight Festival?
That's right. They rehearsed at the place where his band were living.
Brinsley Schwartz were there. Yeah. And so they were asked if they'd mind the band using their equipment for a rehearsal or whatever. And they were thrilled to bits, how excited. And so they all went and stood outside the barn or wherever it was. And the band went in there and picked up Brinsley Schwartz's various bits of equipment, which Brinsley Schwartz always thought were kind of not very good and inadequate to the task. And suddenly, magically, they sounded like the band.
That's right.
The very same stuff. I love
such a distinctive sound. I can remember John Savage once saying to me in the Mojo office, "You listen to the band," and said, "and you can hear the beards." It was a lovely idea.
But also, they got that thing that people said about Little Feat, that nobody is actually playing what you're hearing. Because what you're hearing is the interaction between the instruments. You're entering a completely different space there. And I still, every time, if you've got a copy of the band's second album, go and play it and go and look at the picture, I think it's on the back, of the band. And Levon Helm is playing what appears to be a child drum kit.
Yeah, tiny.
It's smaller. It's tiny. And that is the drum. That is the drum kit that he actually played on that record, because he went and bought it in a charity shop.
Yeah.
And then went off, because they were in Los Angeles, Sammy Davis's pool house, famously.
Yeah.
They weren't in Woodstock.
No, they weren't. It was made in...
They're about as far as possible from that kind of milieu. Yeah. They're in Sammy Davis's pool house. And he created the most desperately imitated drum sound ever from a child's drum kit that he's bought in a charity shop. So to borrow, a cliche from the now disgraced Lance Armstrong, it's not about the bike.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.